Picture this, the desert wind howling through the ruins of a city no map remembers. Beneath your feet, the broken stones still carry the faint scars of chisels that once hacked away names, faces, and entire dynasties. Every mark whispers of a man who tried to bend eternity to his will, and was punished with the most terrifying sentence imaginable in ancient Egypt, to be forgotten. His name was Akhenaten. 17 years he ruled, 17 years that shook the foundations of a civilization built on 3,000 years of unbroken tradition. He looked at the blazing sun and declared that all the gods of his ancestors, Amun, Osiris, Isis, Ra, were nothing but shadows. To him, only one truth existed, Aten, the living sun disk, the creator of all. But this was no simple spiritual awakening. Akhenaten tore down temples, stripped the wealth of priests, and dragged his entire court into the desert to build a city for his god. In its walls, art changed forever, kingship changed forever, and so did his family. For the sake of divine blood, daughters became wives, sisters became queens, and children became pawns in a vision too radical to survive. And yet, when the last stone was struck from his monuments, when even his name was erased, one question remained, echoing across the sands of time: was Akhenaten a mad heretic, or the world's first true prophet? The sound was deafening. Strike after strike, bronze chisels bit into the limestone walls of Karnak. Names were shattered. Faces mutilated. Whole histories carved into stone for centuries were obliterated in a frenzy of destruction. The desert sun bore down mercilessly, the air filled with chalky dust, as if the gods themselves were choking on the memory of a king they wished to erase. It was the year 1334 BC. Across Egypt, workers had been ordered to one single task: erase Akhenaten. His likeness, his titles, even the very hieroglyphs that spelled his name were struck away as though he had never lived. To the ancient Egyptians, this was the most terrifying punishment imaginable: second death. For without a name, without memory, a soul could never find eternity. And yet, only 18 years earlier, this same man had stood at the pinnacle of power. As Amenhotep IV, he inherited the throne of the most prosperous empire on earth. From Nubia's gold mines to the cedar forests of Lebanon, tribute flowed into Egypt. His armies guarded an empire that stretched beyond the Euphrates. His father, Amenhotep III, had left behind temples that glittered with gold and a kingdom confident in its traditions. Amenhotep IV should have followed that path. He should have continued honoring Amun-Ra, king of the gods, maintaining the divine balance, the Ma'at, that had held Egypt strong for centuries. But from the beginning, he was different. Contemporary records describe him as tall, narrow-shouldered, with an oddly elongated skull and hips that gave him an androgynous appearance. Some whispered he looked less like a king and more like a living symbol of contradiction. But it wasn't only his body that set him apart. Something burned inside him, a restless conviction that the world his ancestors built was built on a lie. Each morning, he stood at the banks of the Nile and watched the sun rise from behind the cliffs. The light stretched across the waters, spilling warmth and life over the fields, animals, and people. To him, this was no distant god hidden in a labyrinth of myths and priests. This was the god itself. Pure. Visible. Universal. Historians still debate what planted the seed of revolution in his mind. Was it the temple hymns he studied as a boy, songs that spoke of Aten, the sun disk, as a face of Ra? Was it the whispers of foreign diplomats bringing word of peoples in the Near East experimenting with the worship of a single god? Or was it a private vision, a dream that seared his soul with fire? Whatever the spark, it grew into a conviction so strong that it would overturn 3,000 years of tradition. In the glittering city of Thebes, where colossal temples dominated the skyline and the priests of Amun rivaled even the pharaoh's authority, the young king began to pull away. The Temple of Karnak was not only a religious center but also the beating heart of Egypt's economy. Its priests controlled vast estates, tens of thousands of slaves, herds of cattle, and fertile land that sustained the kingdom. They were more than holy men, they were power incarnate. And into their world stepped a ruler who dared to say, "You are wrong." At first, the signs of rebellion were subtle. In his 4th year on the throne, Amenhotep IV began building temples dedicated not to Ammonius, but to Aten. Not in secret, but directly in the shadow of Karnak itself, as if daring the priests to challenge him. Visitors to these new temples were confronted by something shocking, art that broke every convention. Instead of stiff, eternal poses, carvings showed the royal family bathed in the rays of Aten, each beam ending in tiny hands offering the Ankh, the breath of life. This was no small change. For 3 millennia, Egyptian art had been designed to reflect timeless truths. Pharaohs were always perfect, forever young, their features sculpted into godlike ideals. Now here was a king who let himself be shown with narrow chest, elongated skull, tenderly kissing his daughters under the sun's embrace. Even more radical, his queen, Nefertiti, was shown at his side not as a distant figure but as a living partner, her body and face as central to the divine scene as his own. Marriage in the royal house was usually politics, alliances with noble families, unions that ensured stability. But sources suggest that Akhenaten and Nefertiti shared something closer to love. Together, they named their daughters in honor of Aten, Meketaten, beloved of Aten, Ankhesenpeten, she lives for Aten. Every choice they made was a theological statement, every image a declaration that their God was not hidden in the shadows but radiant in the sky. The priests of Ammonius grew restless. Their god had been worshipped for centuries, their temples grew richer than palaces, their rituals promised eternal life for the dead. They controlled 1/3 of all arable land in Egypt, entire cities of workers, herds numbering in the hundreds of thousands. And now this young pharaoh threatened to tear it all down with the claim that only one god truly existed. It wasn't just religion at stake, it was the foundation of Egypt's power. To elevate Aten meant to strip Ammonius priests of their wealth, their influence, their grip over the people's afterlife. And so, what began as art and whispers soon became revolution. By his 5th year on the throne, Amenhotep IV made his most audacious move. He cast aside the name that honored Ammonius and declared himself Akhenaten, effective for Aten. It was no longer a matter of preference, it was a proclamation. From this moment on, every monument, every inscription, every prayer would bear the mark of his god. The desert winds carried the whispers. Was this man a visionary, chosen by the sun itself? Or was he a dangerous heretic, condemning his empire to ruin? The chisels would one day answer. But for now, in the blazing light of Aten, Akhenaten's revolution had only just begun. Long before his name was cursed and struck from stone, Akhenaten entered the world as Amenhotep IV, the son of one of Egypt's most celebrated rulers. His father, Amenhotep III, had reigned for nearly 4 decades during what many call a golden age. Under the elder pharaoh's watch, Egypt overflowed with wealth. Gold streamed in from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from the heart of Africa. Foreign kings sent tribute and sought marriages into his household. His temples gleamed with offerings, his palaces were filled with music and luxury. For the people of Egypt, it seemed the gods had blessed Amenhotep III with prosperity unrivaled in memory. Into this glittering world was born a prince who should have followed the same well-worn path, uphold the worship of Ammonius Ra, maintain the cosmic balance of Ma'at, and safeguard the prosperity of Egypt. But Amenhotep IV was not like his father. From childhood, he stood apart. Ancient depictions suggest a figure that defied the ideals of Egyptian beauty. Where other princes were sculpted into athletic perfection, he appeared tall, thin, almost fragile, with narrow shoulders, a protruding belly, and elongated features. Later artists would exaggerate these traits, making him look grotesque, but even in youth, it was clear he did not embody the warrior king archetype. To some in the palace, he seemed weak. To others, uncanny. But perhaps it was precisely this difference that shaped his destiny. The boy prince was educated as every royal child was. Tutors taught him hieroglyphs, mathematics, astronomy, statecraft, and military tactics. He learned the rituals that connected king and gods, the sacred myths, and the songs of praise. But somewhere in this conventional curriculum, the seeds of doubt began to grow. Perhaps in the temple schools, where he first heard hymns dedicated to Aten, not just as a face of Ra, but as the universal source of life. Perhaps in hushed conversations with foreigners, who brought tales of distant lands where single gods were worshipped above all others. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Each dawn on the Nile, the young prince watched the sun rise from behind the eastern cliffs, flooding the valley with warmth, and felt it speak to him. For most Egyptians, the sun was a symbol, a cycle among many cycles, one god among hundreds. But for Amenhotep IV, it was more. It was the heartbeat of existence itself, visible to all, needing no priest to explain its power. Where others saw ritual, he saw truth. Still, the court around him remained rooted in tradition. Thebes in the mid-14th century BC was a dazzling city of gods and kings. Towering pylons and temples dominated its skyline. Karnak, the largest temple complex in the ancient world, was an empire unto itself. Thousands of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and servants worked daily within its walls. Its treasuries bulged with gold and tribute, its estates stretched for miles. The high priest of Ammonius was no mere servant of the gods, he was a rival power to the throne itself. In this world of rigid hierarchies and sacred order, Amenhotep IV seemed an anomaly. Where others embraced ceremony, he appeared distant. Where the court glorified tradition, he showed little interest. He was married young to the beautiful Nefertiti, likely as part of a political alliance, but their union quickly defied expectations. Unlike the cold, formal partnerships common in pharaonic households, the two appeared close, even affectionate. Later reliefs show them side by side, touching, smiling, their daughters playing around them. For a royal house where intimacy was rarely depicted, this was extraordinary. As crown prince, Amenhotep IV was expected to prepare for war and diplomacy, to command armies and ensure Egypt's dominance abroad. Yet his gaze turned inward, toward the blazing disk of the sun and the mystery it represented. While generals planned campaigns, he meditated on light. While priests recited centuries-old hymns to Ammonius, he imagined a world where only one god reigned. At the time, no one could have guessed how far he would take this vision. The elder Amenhotep's reign remained strong, and the boy was simply one among many royal children. Yet when his father died and the young prince ascended the throne, the seeds of revolution were already alive within him. In his early years as pharaoh, the court of Thebes carried on as usual. Festivals honored Ammonius with parades of gilded barges, priests chanted in candlelit sanctuaries, and offerings poured into the great temple. But quietly, change began. By his fourth year, Amenhotep IV commissioned new temples, not for Ammonius, but for Aten. The construction rose brazenly in the shadow of Karnak, as though daring the old priesthood to take notice. The art that adorned these new shrines stunned contemporaries. For 3 millennia, Egyptian art had followed strict conventions, pharaohs always idealized, gods depicted in eternal poses, every image meant to embody timeless order. But in the reliefs of Aten's temples, pharaoh and queen were shown not as distant icons but as human beings. They stood together beneath Aten's rays, each beam ending in a hand offering the Ankh, the breath of life. Their children reached toward them, laughing, clinging, alive. For those who had only ever seen gods as remote, inaccessible beings, this art was shocking. It suggested that divinity was not hidden in dark temples, not mediated by priests, but shining openly in the sky for all to see. It suggested that the royal family themselves were the chosen vessels of this new truth. The reaction was swift. Priests of Ammonius whispered in alarm. Nobles muttered uneasily. But to the young pharaoh, there was no turning back. He believed he had seen the essence of creation, and nothing else mattered. By his 5th year, the whispers became thunder. He discarded his birth name, severing the tie to Ammonius. From that day forward, he would be called Akhenaten, effective for Aten. With one declaration, he transformed himself from a traditional pharaoh into a revolutionary. His queen's name, too, changed. Nefertiti became Neferneferuiten, beautiful are the beauties of Aten. Even their children bore names proclaiming their devotion to the sun. The stage was set. This was no longer the story of a prince who felt different. It was the beginning of a war between a pharaoh and the gods of Egypt themselves. And in that moment, as the sun burned high over Thebes, Egypt's destiny shifted. A kingdom built on 3,000 years of tradition would soon face its greatest upheaval. In the early years of his reign, Egypt still looked unchanged. Thebes remained a city of gods, its streets thronged with processions for Ammonius, Osiris, and Ra priests in feathered headdresses carried gilded barks through the avenues, incense smoke filled the air, and hymns rose in thunderous chorus. To most of the kingdom, life continued as it had for centuries. But beneath the surface, a quiet rebellion was beginning. By the 4th year of his rule, Amenhotep IV had made a daring decision. Instead of adding his name to the long list of benefactors who enriched the great temple of Ammonius, he commissioned shrines for another god, Aten. These new structures did not rise in some distant corner of the empire. They rose in the shadow of Karnak itself, as if to declare open challenge. For the priests who ruled Thebes with nearly as much authority as the king, it was an unmistakable warning: the young pharaoh was not one of them. The shrines themselves were different. Where the sanctuaries of Ammonius were enclosed, shadowy spaces where only the high priest could glimpse the inner mysteries, Aten's altars stood open to the sky. Sunlight fell directly onto the offering tables. There were no veils, no hidden chambers, only the blazing presence of the visible sun. But the greatest shock came not in the stones of the temples, but in the images carved upon them. Egyptian art, for 3,000 years, had been a language of permanence. Kings were immortalized as perfect beings, muscular, ageless, unchanging. Every figure was drawn in rigid profile, every gesture standardized to symbolize eternal truth. But now, in the reliefs commissioned by Amenhotep IV, something new appeared. The royal family. Not the distant, godlike icons of past dynasties, but a living household. The king and his queen, Nefertiti, stood together beneath Aten's rays, not stiff and cold, but tender. Their daughters reached up to them, small arms stretching for their parents. One carving shows the king leaning down to kiss his child. Another depicts Nefertiti cradling a daughter, her face gentle, almost smiling. Each beam of the sun ended not in abstract light, but in tiny carved hands, each offering the ankh, the symbol of life, to the king and queen. It was revolutionary. Imagine the shock of the courtiers who saw these scenes unveiled. For generations, pharaohs had been depicted as distant gods, their families rarely acknowledged except as symbols. Here was a ruler who placed not only himself but also his wife and children at the center of divine imagery. It suggested something unheard of, that divinity was not confined to the gods of old or to the pharaoh alone, but extended through the living bonds of his household, illuminated by Aten. At the heart of this transformation was Nefertiti. Unlike many queens before her, she did not stand in the shadows. She appeared beside the king, equal in scale, equal in position. In some reliefs, she even performs rituals traditionally reserved for the pharaoh. Her name, later lengthened to Neferneferuiten, beautiful are the beauties of Aten, became inseparable from her husband's revolution. Together, they formed a partnership that radiated power and intimacy, an image of unity that challenged every expectation of Egyptian kingship. But art was not merely decoration in Egypt. It was theology in stone. To show the king and queen as tender parents beneath Aten's rays was to declare that their family itself was the channel of divine life. To the priests of Ammonius, it was more than a personal quirk, it was heresy. Whispers began to spread. Why was the king turning away from the gods who had protected Egypt for centuries? Why elevate a minor solar deity above Ammonius, lord of creation? For the priests, the danger was not only spiritual but economic. The temple of Ammonius at Karnak controlled unimaginable wealth, land, cattle, slaves, and trade networks that reached across the empire. To diminish Ammonius was to threaten the foundation of Egypt's prosperity. And yet, the king did not stop. In fact, he pressed harder. The names of his daughters made his devotion unmistakable. Meketaten, beloved of Aten. Akhetaten, she lives for Aten. Every child carried in her very name the proof of the new theology. It was not merely the king's faith, it was his legacy, inscribed into the next generation. By the 5th year, the transformation leapt from art to politics. Amenhotep IV discarded his birth name, severing the tie to Ammonius, and proclaimed himself Akhenaten, effective for Aten. Nefertiti's name was changed as well, sanctified in the new faith. Even the city itself would be transformed, though the full extent of his vision was still hidden. For ordinary Egyptians, the changes were bewildering. In villages and towns, they still prayed to Isis for protection in childbirth, to Osiris for safe passage to the afterlife, to Thoth for wisdom. These gods were woven into the rhythm of life, into festivals, rituals, and family shrines. Now their pharaoh claimed that all of it was false. To the peasants in the fields, to the craftsmen in the workshops, it must have felt like the earth shifting beneath their feet. But for Akhenaten, there was no hesitation. He believed the truth was too bright to ignore. Where others saw the complexity of dozens of gods, he saw only one, the blazing sun, visible to all, impartial to rich and poor alike. To him, it was not merely religion. It was revelation. Still, revelations have consequences. As the sun rose over Thebes, casting its first light on the towering pylons of Karnak, priests looked at the growing shrines of Aten and saw a threat to everything they had built. For 3,000 years, their rituals had maintained order. For 3,000 years, their gods had guarded Egypt. And now, one man's vision threatened to sweep it all away. In those first years of open defiance, the chisels were still carving, the temples still rising, and the royal family still basked in Aten's rays with joy. But already, the storm was gathering. The art that seemed tender to some looked blasphemous to others. The love between king and queen, celebrated in carvings, was to traditionalists a distortion of the eternal order. The children's laughter carved in stone was, to the priesthood, a dangerous redefinition of divinity itself. Egypt was on the edge of something it had never seen before. And the man at its center, illuminated by the rising sun, believed he was leading his people into truth. What he could not see was that the same light that gave him power would one day burn away his name. By his 5th year on the throne, the transformation could no longer be ignored. The young pharaoh had cast off his birth name, Amenhotep IV, and proclaimed himself Akhenaten, effective for Aten. In a single stroke, he severed ties with Ammonius, the god who had dominated Egypt for centuries. It was more than a name change, it was a declaration of war. The new faith had already taken root in art and ritual. Now, it spread into every corner of politics, economy, and daily life. In Thebes, offerings that once poured into the temple of Ammonius were diverted to Aten. Festivals that had filled the streets with music and incense were replaced by ceremonies beneath the open sky. Priests who had enjoyed unrivaled wealth found themselves stripped of authority. For the first time in generations, the balance of power tilted away from Karnak. Akhenaten's vision was radical. Unlike the hidden sanctuaries of Egypt's old religion, Aten's worship took place under sunlight, visible to all. There were no secret chambers, no intermediaries, no elaborate myths requiring priestly interpretation. The god was present in the blazing orb above, self-evident, undeniable. Every dawn became a resurrection, every sunset a reminder of mortality, every ray of light a promise of life. But the economic stakes were staggering. The temple of Ammonius alone owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land, herds of livestock, and a labor force that numbered in the tens of thousands. By dismantling this structure, Akhenaten was not simply changing gods, he was dismantling an empire within the empire. The priests of Ammonius had long rivaled the throne in wealth and influence. Now, they watched as their power slipped away into the hands of a pharaoh who claimed the sun itself as his only ally. And Akhenaten was not finished. In his 6th year as king, he made a decision that shocked Egypt to its core. He would abandon Thebes, the city that had served as the heart of religious and political life for 5 centuries. He would leave behind its temples, its palaces, its ancestral tombs. In its place, he would build a new capital on virgin land, untouched by the old gods. The site he chose lay on the east bank of the Nile, midway between Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south. It was an empty stretch of desert, framed by limestone cliffs that curved like a natural amphitheater. At dawn, the sun rose directly between those cliffs, casting its first light across the plain. To Akhenaten, it was the perfect stage. He named the city Akhetaten, horizon of Aten. The decision was staggering. Thebes was more than a city, it was the burial ground of kings, the center of empire, the keeper of 3,000 years of tradition. To leave it was to abandon not only history, but also the machinery of governance, its scribes, its administrators, its skilled artisans. But Akhenaten was determined. In his mind, Aten demanded nothing less than a fresh beginning, a clean slate upon which to inscribe a new world. Construction began immediately. Tens of thousands of workers were conscripted to the site. Limestone was quarried from the cliffs, sandstone hauled from Nubia, cedar shipped from Lebanon. The Nile became a lifeline, carrying materials from across the empire. Unlike the colossal stone blocks of traditional temples, Akhenaten's architects used smaller, standardized blocks called talatat. Each was light enough for a single man to carry, allowing the city to rise with astonishing speed. Within just 2 years, the skeleton of a capital stretched for miles along the river. Palaces with wide courtyards, administrative offices, residences for courtiers, and most importantly, vast temples dedicated to Aten. At the city's heart stood the Great Temple of Aten, a complex unlike any Egypt had seen. Covering an immense area, it was built without roofs, its courts and halls open entirely to the sky. Hundreds of offering tables lined its courtyards, each one ready to bear bread, beer, meat, and flowers to the god who required no darkness, no mystery, only light. The theology of Atenism developed alongside the city. Where other gods were bound to stories and images, Aten was described as formless, beyond representation, a universal creator whose power sustained all life. Hymns carved into tombs and temples celebrated Aten as the source of every creature, every nation, every breath of wind. One such hymn, perhaps composed by Akhenaten himself, proclaimed, "You alone are God, like whom there is no other. You made the earth according to your desire, mankind, cattle, beasts, all that is on earth, all that flies with its wings." To modern readers, these words sound strikingly close to later monotheistic traditions. To the ancient Egyptians, they were unprecedented. The pantheon of hundreds was swept aside by the worship of a single god whose image was the very sun in the sky. By the 9th year of his reign, Akhenaten moved his entire court to the new capital. The royal family occupied palaces decorated not with scenes of conquest and divine judgment, but with gardens, pools, and images of birds, flowers, and streams. Courtyards were filled with sunlight, windows open to the air, walls painted with naturalistic scenes. Life in Akhetaten felt less like a fortress of kingship and more like an earthly paradise. Every day revolved around Aten. At dawn, the court gathered in the great temple to greet the sun's rising. At midday, offerings were made as Aten reached its zenith. At sunset, somber rituals marked the god's retreat beyond the western horizon. For those who lived within the royal circle, it was an exhilarating experiment, a new rhythm of life, guided not by tradition but by the movement of the sun itself. But outside the city, not all shared this joy. In the villages of the Nile Valley, people still whispered prayers to Isis, Anubis, and Osiris. Farmers buried charms in their fields, mothers prayed to Hathor for protection in childbirth. Aten was too abstract, too distant. He was the sun for all, but he was not the god who listened to personal fears and hopes. For common Egyptians, Akhenaten's revolution felt less like liberation and more like exile, from the gods who had guided their lives for generations. Still, in the heart of Akhetaten, the experiment thrived. The pharaoh believed he had remade the world. The priests of Ammonius were scattered, their temples deprived of wealth. The old order seemed broken, the horizon reborn. Yet even as sunlight filled every corner of the new city, shadows gathered at its edges. Egypt's vassals abroad began sending frantic letters, begging for military aid against invaders. The empire's borders trembled, but Akhenaten's eyes remained fixed on the sky, not the battlefield. Within the palaces, his daughters played beneath Aten's rays, their laughter immortalized in art. But soon, those same daughters would become part of an even darker design. For now, the experiment shone bright. A new god, a new city, a new world. But history would prove that no sun, no matter how brilliant, can burn forever. At the heart of Akhetaten, the palaces gleamed with painted walls of birds, flowers, and streams. Sunlight poured into open courtyards, children's laughter echoed in gardens fed by channels from the Nile. To an outsider, it looked like paradise. But behind the serene imagery carved in stone, the royal household was descending into tragedy. For all his devotion to Aten, Akhenaten faced a problem as old as kingship itself, succession. Pharaohs were expected to secure their line with male heirs, to ensure continuity of dynasty and the favor of the gods. Yet after years of marriage, Akhenaten and his beloved queen Nefertiti had produced only daughters. 6 in total: Meketaten, Meketaten, Tutankhaten, Neferneferutin Tashret, Neferneferur, and Setapenra. Not one son. In a society where the king's legitimacy was bound to divine blood, this was a crisis. Other dynasties had solved such dilemmas by bringing in nephews, brothers, or distant cousins. But Akhenaten's revolution had narrowed his options. Any successor had to be utterly loyal to Aten. To bring in a prince tied to the old gods risked undoing everything. And so, the pharaoh turned inward, to his own children. The first signs appeared in the 12th year of his reign, when Nefertiti suddenly vanished from the record. Whether she died of illness, fell from favor, or was elevated into co-rulership under another name remains one of Egypt's enduring mysteries. Whatever the cause, her absence left a void at the pharaoh's side, both politically and symbolically. In a system where queen and king together embodied divine harmony beneath Aten, her disappearance demanded replacement. That replacement was his eldest daughter, Meketaten. Reliefs from this period show her stepping into her mother's place, standing beside her father in rituals, receiving Aten's rays, even wearing the crown of queenship. She was barely 16. To the outside world, the imagery was unsettling enough, father and daughter depicted as king and queen. But within the palace walls, the arrangement was more than symbolic. Meketaten became her father's great royal wife, the official queen of Egypt. To modern minds, the shock is immediate. But even in ancient Egypt, where sibling marriages among royals were not unheard of, the systematic way Akhenaten reorganized his household went beyond precedent. The justification lay in theology. Aten, the sun disk, was described as both father and mother of creation. By uniting with his daughter, Akhenaten claimed he was reflecting this cosmic self-generation on earth. To him, it was not scandal, it was divine necessity. But for the young princess, the reality must have been devastating. Carved as a child in scenes of play, suddenly she was transformed into queen and consort, responsible for bearing the heir her mother could not. Contemporary inscriptions hint at her prominence. Foreign envoys addressed her as the king's daughter, the queen. Within the shimmering halls of Akhetaten, she lived as both daughter and wife, a role as heavy as the desert sun. The story grew darker still. In the following years, Meketaten was married again, this time to Smenkhare, a shadowy figure who may have been Akhenaten's brother, adopted son, or co-regent. The girl became wife to both father and co-ruler, her life entangled in dynastic desperation. Reliefs show her standing between them, embodying a union that was less love than a political calculation to keep power locked within Aten's circle. And she was not alone. After Meketaten, another daughter rose to queenship, Akhetaten, perhaps no more than 13 or 14 at the time. She too was placed beside her father in ceremonies, crowned as great royal wife. Her very name, She Lives for Aten, seemed to echo the burden placed upon her, that her youth, her body, her future were dedicated not to herself, but to her father's vision. The palace grew tangled in roles that blurred every boundary. Daughters became wives. Sisters became stepmothers. Aunts became rivals. To outsiders, the family that once symbolized divine harmony now appeared a knot of contradictions. Yet within Akhetaten, the king pressed forward, convinced that only through these unions could Aten's revolution endure. The cost soon became undeniable. In the royal tombs at Amarna, one of the most haunting scenes of Egyptian art has been preserved, the death of Meketaten, Akhenaten's second daughter. She is shown on a birthing bed, surrounded by mourners. A nurse holds a newborn child, while attendants grieve. The imagery suggests she died in childbirth, perhaps bearing her own father's child. If true, it was the most tragic proof of the price exacted by this theology, a girl scarcely grown, sacrificed to an experiment in divine kingship. For the surviving sisters, the shadow must have been terrifying. In the painted walls of their childhood, they had been shown as laughing children beneath Aten's rays. Now, they watched as those same rays marked them for roles they did not choose. In every embrace, in every crown placed upon their heads, the weight of their father's obsession pressed down harder. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Egypt itself was unraveling. The letters from vassals in Syria and Palestine grew more desperate, cities under siege, enemies advancing, allies begging for troops. Yet Akhenaten remained focused inward, on ceremonies, on family, on Aten. The empire that his father had held together with armies and diplomacy began to crumble. Within Akhetaten, art still depicted scenes of joy, the royal family dining together, children reaching for their parents, Aten's rays blessing them all. But beneath the surface, those images had changed. Once they were symbols of warmth and intimacy. Now they carried an unsettling double meaning, daughters as wives, children as heirs of both divine light and human tragedy. By the 15th year of his reign, the experiment had consumed nearly everyone in the palace. Meketaten was queen, then consort to Smenkhare. Ankhesenpeten became queen in her turn. Meketaten was dead in childbirth. The younger daughters lived in a house where sisters became mothers, and every girl knew her fate might soon follow. To Akhenaten, it was a reflection of divine unity, an earthly echo of Aten's power. To his people, it was incomprehensible. To history, it became a warning, that in pursuit of purity, kings can destroy the very bloodline they seek to preserve. And still, the sun rose each morning over the cliffs of Akhetaten, casting its rays across palaces and temples. To the king, each dawn was proof that his revolution was eternal. But to those who lived in his shadow, the light was blinding, and the darkness it cast was growing deeper. By the 17th year of his reign, Akhenaten's dream city still gleamed beneath the desert sun. Its open temples filled with offerings, its walls alive with images of the royal family beneath Aten's rays. To the faithful within Akhetaten, the vision seemed secure. Yet beyond the city's gates, cracks had spread too wide to ignore. Egypt's empire was crumbling, foreign vassals abandoned, the people restless, the priesthood of Amun silently waiting for its return. And then, suddenly, the light dimmed. In 1336 BC, Akhenaten died. No inscription records his final moments, no tomb scene immortalizes his passing. For a man who had proclaimed himself the sole intermediary between heaven and earth, the silence is deafening. Did he waste away from illness, the victim of a genetic disorder worsened by generations of inbreeding? Did the strain of rule and obsession break his body? Or did his own courtiers quietly hasten his end, tired of watching the empire collapse while their king worshipped the sun? History gives us no answer. His death was as mysterious as his life was radical. What followed was chaos. The throne may first have passed to Nefertiti, a shadowy figure whose identity is still debated. Some scholars believe she was Nefertiti, ruling under a new name. Others suggest she was Meketaten, Akhenaten's daughter-wife. Whoever she was, her reign was brief, perhaps no more than 2 years. She tried to maintain Aten's revolution, but the tide was already turning. In the provinces, priests of Ammonius who had been silenced returned to their shrines. Farmers whispered the old prayers to Isis and Osiris. Soldiers, weary of neglect, turned back to the gods who had guarded them for centuries. The people had endured nearly 2 decades of disruption, festivals suppressed, traditions abandoned, gods declared false. Aten's brilliance had never warmed their hearts. Now, in the absence of Akhenaten's fierce will, it began to fade. Into this vacuum stepped a child. Tutankhaten, a boy of 8 or 9, took the throne. He was likely Akhenaten's son, born of one of his sister wives, making him the product of close inbreeding. Modern DNA analysis has confirmed genetic disorders in his lineage, evidence of the dangerous unions meant to preserve divine blood. Frail in body, the boy was a fragile vessel for the hopes of a dying revolution. Around him, powerful men moved quickly. The Vizier I, an elder statesman who had long served the court, and the General Horemheb, commander of Egypt's armies, saw the chance to restore stability. They guided the boy's hand, and within 3 years, his name changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. With that single act, the revolution ended. The court abandoned Akhetaten. The city, once filled with thousands, was left to the desert. Palaces crumbled, temples fell silent, homes emptied. Only the wind and sand remained, reclaiming what had been built in such haste. Tutankhamun's court returned to Memphis and Thebes, to the ancestral centers of power, to the tombs of kings and temples of gods that had never truly died. The restoration was swift. Temples to Ammonius reopened, their treasuries refilled, their priests restored to authority. Hymns once banned were sung again. Festivals returned, the processions of gilded barges filled the avenues, and incense smoke once more curled into the air. The official decree of restoration described the Amarna period not simply as a heresy, but as a cosmic disorder, a time when the gods had turned their backs on Egypt. It proclaimed, the land was in chaos, the gods abandoned their shrines, their sanctuaries overgrown with weeds. But now they return, their hearts restored. The message was clear, Akhenaten's reign had been not a bold truth, but a disaster, and Egypt must be healed by forgetting. Tutankhamun reigned only briefly, dying around the age of 19. His death, whether from illness, accident, or conspiracy, remains debated. He left no heir, and his fragile body was laid in a modest tomb, hastily prepared. Yet ironically, his name would survive as one of the most famous pharaohs in history, thanks to the treasures discovered by Howard Carter in 1922. After Tutankhamun came I, who reigned only a few years, then the General Horemheb seized the throne. Unlike the boy king, Horemheb was determined not merely to restore tradition, but to erase the revolution entirely. His campaign was ruthless. Every mention of Akhenaten's name was chiseled from stone. Statues of the heretic king were smashed, his cartouches hammered out. The great city of Akhetaten was systematically dismantled, its stones carted away to build new temples for Ammonius. Official king lists skipped over Akhenaten as though he had never ruled, leaping from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb. To the Egyptians, this was more than politics. It was a spiritual execution. To be forgotten was the worst fate imaginable, the second death, when even memory is erased. Akhenaten, who had dreamed of eternal light, was condemned to darkness, his vision blotted from history for over 3 millennia. And yet, the silence was not absolute. Beneath the sands, the ruins of Amarna lay waiting. In the tombs, the strange art of the Aten period lingered, images of intimacy and distortion that defied the conventions of all other dynasties. And centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered them, the forgotten pharaoh's story rose again. But in his own time, the judgment was clear. His god abandoned, his city deserted, his name cursed, Akhenaten became a warning etched in absence, that no man, however powerful, could defy 3,000 years of tradition and survive. Still, as the desert winds swept through the ruins of Akhetaten, one could almost imagine his voice carried on the dust, a man who once declared that only the sun was true, a man whose vision burned too bright for his world. When Tutankhamun died suddenly at about 19, Egypt once again faced uncertainty. His reign had been guided by powerful advisors, the elderly vizier, and Horemheb, the ambitious general. I ruled briefly, perhaps only 4 years, leaving little impact. Then came Horemheb, a soldier who seized the throne with the backing of the army. Unlike his fragile predecessors, he was determined not only to restore the old order but to erase all memory of the heretic who had dared to challenge it. What followed was one of the most systematic campaigns of historical erasure in human history. Horemheb ordered the chisels brought out again, not to carve monuments, but to destroy them. Across Egypt, artisans hacked away at walls, smashing cartouches that bore Akhenaten's name. Reliefs showing the royal family beneath Aten's rays were mutilated, their faces obliterated. Statues of the heretic Pharaoh were toppled, their fragments scattered into rubble. The great city of Akhetaten, once a symbol of radiant new beginnings, was abandoned. Workers dismantled its temples stone by stone, carting the blocks away to be reused in other projects. Archaeologists centuries later would find Aten's Tutankhaten blocks recycled in the foundations of new temples dedicated to Amun, pieces of a revolution buried inside monuments to the very god it sought to destroy. Official records sealed the verdict. King lists compiled by later dynasties skipped directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, erasing nearly 2 decades of history as though they had never happened. The names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Meketaten, even Tutankhamun were struck from memory. For the Egyptians, this was no small slight. To erase a name was to deny a soul eternal life. It was, in their belief, a second death. Akhenaten, who had built his entire reign around the promise of eternal light, was condemned to darkness, his very existence denied. And yet, complete silence never truly lasts. For over 3,000 years, Akhetaten lay hidden beneath the sands. The desert preserved its strange art, its broken walls, its haunting tombs. In the 19th century, archaeologists began uncovering the ruins, and with them, the story of a pharaoh almost lost to time. Reliefs of Akhenaten's elongated figure, tenderly embracing his daughters beneath Aten's rays, shocked scholars who had known only the rigid idealism of other dynasties. The so-called Amarna style revealed a moment when Egyptian art broke its chains, depicting intimacy, humanity, even vulnerability. More disturbing discoveries followed. Tomb scenes showed princesses elevated to queenship, hinting at incestuous unions that had long been whispered about. The death of Meketaten, likely in childbirth, appeared in chilling detail. Forensic studies of Tutankhamun's mummy in the 21st century confirmed genetic disorders consistent with inbreeding, supporting the idea that Akhenaten's desperate obsession with divine bloodlines had cost his dynasty its health and future. Yet alongside tragedy, scholars also found something else, words that seemed to echo far beyond the Nile. The great hymn to Aten, attributed to Akhenaten himself, described a single God, creator of all nations, who gave life to every creature. Its verses bear striking resemblance to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible. Did Aten's revolution influence the birth of monotheism elsewhere? Or were the similarities coincidence, the product of human beings everywhere gazing at the same sun and drawing the same conclusions? Historians still debate, but the possibility alone is astonishing. For modern eyes, Akhenaten remains a paradox. Was he a visionary, centuries ahead of his time, glimpsing truths that others could not? Or was he a fanatic, blind to the suffering his obsession caused, willing to sacrifice empire, family, and legacy to a god of his own making? The answer lies somewhere between. He was both, a man whose vision soared beyond the horizon, yet whose methods chained his family and kingdom to tragedy. Today, walking through the ruins of Amarna, one can still feel his presence. The foundations of palaces stretch beneath the desert sky, the outlines of temples open to the light. Carved on the walls of half-collapsed tombs, the royal family smiles eternally beneath Aten's rays, as if time itself could not silence them. And scattered across Egypt, in the blocks of other temples, fragments of Akhenaten's revolution lie hidden, silent witnesses to a forgotten dream. The Egyptians who came after him succeeded in erasing his memory from their own history. But they could not erase the questions he left behind. What does it mean to worship only one God? Can truth be imposed by force, even if it feels divine? What happens when a king's vision collides with the weight of tradition? Akhenaten's story is not merely that of a heretic king. It is a reminder that even in the most ancient of civilizations, individuals could rise to challenge everything their world believed. Sometimes, they are crushed. Sometimes, they are erased. But sometimes, just sometimes, their whispers survive the chisels, carried on desert winds across millennia, waiting to be heard again. In the end, Akhenaten was denied the immortality he sought. But paradoxically, through his erasure, he achieved another kind of immortality. Today, the man who once was condemned to be forgotten is remembered by millions, his face among the most recognizable of Egypt's long line of kings. His god has vanished, his city is dust, but his story endures, as a sun that once blazed too brightly, and left its burn upon history.